Okay, welcome everybody. I'm the last thing, I think, standing between you and the coffee break. So what I want to talk about just a little bit, and it's actually, I had a very good introduction from Henrik about cars, right? So I've worked kind of in a similar space before my current job, and it has been very interesting to think about how that applies to APIs. So the space that I've worked in was IoT kind of things. We like to call it web of things because we try to apply web principles to it, but in the end it was IoT kind of things. And the challenges you have there really are the ones that you have things that may be very long-lived, you don't have any control over them, they evolve over time, right? Your things may get more complicated, more complex, they may get new features, and you have very little control over the consumers of the things. There's nothing you can see. I don't know. I had it. Some gremlins. I don't know. I see it on my screen. That's not a very good. Sorry. I don't know. Was it ever up there? No. And nobody said anything. Okay. Just like staring at blank screens. Okay. Well, I'll just keep talking, I guess. Can we? Okay. So I hope we'll get that fixed in a minute. But until that is done, let me just continue with my introduction a little bit. So the challenges that we had were similar. So I worked at Siemens, and Siemens, kind of similar, you could say, to Volvo or car manufacturers, right? Is a company that manufactures lots of things, potentially very expensive things, and you want to have people having access to those things, and you also want to make sure that that access is decoupled, right? So that even though those things may be around for a long time, not necessarily the same versions of applications or whatever you would like to call them will talk to those things over time. And the challenge there is, in essence, loose coupling, right? How do you design APIs in a way that you have as much independence between the providers of that information, the things themselves, or some kind of proxies, and the consumers of those services? And what I want to talk about today, thank you very much, it's up there, is basically one pattern of doing that. And I also want to do a little bit of advertisement for that pattern because I don't see it enough. And I think that it's something that as API practitioners and as API designers and managers, we should at least consider that pattern more. And the pattern that I want to talk about is something where you separate your API and certain values that you use within the API. And that pattern is registries, right? And I want to talk a little bit about why it matters and how you can use it, and then show a little bit what's going on in that space. And also I would like to encourage you to just think about that design pattern for APIs and maybe consider it when you're designing APIs and when you try to design APIs that have a very long lifespan. And as a bit of motivation, I can tell you that so most of my work that I've been doing over the past, all of my career basically, has been with IETF specifications and W3C specifications, right, two big standardization bodies. And when you look at IETF, which have given us the majority of all the internet standards that we're using, right? They use this pattern all the time. IETF has about 2,000 registries, right? They maintain many, many registries for APIs, many of them for APIs, not all of them, right? But many of them for APIs, because they know that even though the protocol, the API, should remain stable, and IETF has a lot of interest in stable protocols, they know that certain value spaces will evolve over time. Right? So they separate those two things and say, we like to keep the protocol stable, but we also would like those values to evolve over time, and we provide a place where people can look up which values are well known at any point in time. And that's the pattern that I want to talk about a little bit. And the motivation for that really is that when you look at microservices and the API landscape in general, we now have this increasing diversity and this increasing dynamic of more and more services and things becoming available. And then as API people, our challenge is how do we not just happily design all those APIs, right? Like the little yellow guys I showed yesterday, the minions, just very energetic, but not a lot of perspective. But how can we do that in a way that those things maybe have a long lifespan? Also, we don't really reinvent the wheel every single time, right? We use certain design patterns, so how are good ways of how we can do that? And one space where that really was very apparent to me when we looked at it in my Siemens job was the Internet of Things and specifically wearable devices, right? These kind of things that sometimes things like these watches or Fitbands or whatever, and then any other kind of connected things that emit all this interesting information, but also give us this confusing landscape of APIs and information models that we have to work with. And how to best manage that, I think that is a challenge where we still really don't have good answers and we don't have a lot of examples to look up to and a lot of good practice in the web API space, but I think we can learn a lot from the lessons that have been applied, for example, in the ITF space. So what I want to talk about very, very briefly, because that is something that is currently happening within W3C. If you have any more interest in that, feel free to reach out to me or just go to the W3C and look at their current specifications that they're doing. So currently what they're working on is something that's called activity streams. Who here has heard of activity streams? Oh, one. Thank you very much. Great. Okay, so there's a lot of news coming from me. That's very good. So activity streams is a thing that initially the motivation was to come up with a protocol for social interactions. So the assumption being that if I post something on Facebook, you theoretically, even though Facebook of course has a different plan, but you could think that this message goes away from Facebook to other consumers and says, Eric posted something on Facebook and it can show up on other platforms, right? It could show up on Twitter or whatever, right? So you could imagine those social networks talking to each other. That's the idea of activity streams. Now, the social networks have different plans because they want to remain closed. But the point is that even though they want to remain closed, they also have very, very complicated service landscapes. So they have an interest in actually having protocols how their own internal services can talk to each other. And also companies that are in the business of building big information systems for enterprises have the same goal. So one typical example there is that if you do software development tooling, then you might have testing tools, you might have version control tools, you might have deployment tools, and those also should be able to talk to each other and say, user X just checked in this version just failed this test. This test just, or this issue was just raised against this version of the software, right? All of these could be activities, and all of these tools could talk to each other. So that's the general idea of activity streams, having this very simple model of activities going on, originating in the social space, but not specifically for the social space only. And the protocol that currently is close to completion, it's not an official standard yet, is called now Activity Streams 2.0 because they overhauled it quite a bit. And I will cut my description of it a little short so that I don't run over time, but just give you a very brief idea of how it's designed and why I think it's at least an interesting design, even though you might not be interested in the protocol itself, and why you could consider that design maybe as an inspiration for something that you are doing when you want to design or manage APIs, and also want to manage the diversity of evolving landscapes. So how this protocol works is really very, very simple. It has this idea of activities, which come in streams. And activities are something that are really very simple, right? The simplest thing being that Facebook-like thing of saying, Eric just did something, right? So let's assume Flickr would publish an activity stream, then it would be able to say, okay, Eric just added a picture to Flickr, and that statement would identify me as an actor. It would identify the activity added. It would identify the object, and I have to show you this. These things really exist. And it would also identify the target of that activity, which in that case would be my Flickr page or whatever, right? So it's relatively simple how all of that works. But what's interesting is that activity streams doesn't really hard code any of those things. So even though they say there are certain base activities that exist, such as adding things and liking things, the typical social media things, you could also have other vocabularies, right? And I think that is the very interesting lesson from activity streams that tell you you can separate the protocol, the API, from some of the aspects that you expect to evolve over time, right? Where you say, by now I'm identifying 20 different activity types that can happen, and I might add more over time. And the interesting part about that is that it decouples the protocol from that value space. And you have to be clear about how clients have to behave so that, for example, you could say, if a client sees an activity that the client doesn't understand, it doesn't really mean what that activity does because the client is older than the activity, so to speak, what should the client do? Right? Should it stop and yell and say, hey, something happened, I don't know what, I'm stopping? Or should it just ignore that activity? Or should it do its best to at least display a little text snippet that says, I don't really know what it means, but at least I'm creating some alert, whatever. Right? That depends on what that space looks like for you. But the idea, at least, that you don't have to update any of the API if you add more activities or more object types, that is something that I think is a very valuable thing to do. And the challenge then for designers is to think about, well, if I'm coming up with a great new software that creates new activities, new things can happen in that new software, do I use existing activity types or do I make up my own, right? And this is where things get tricky. This is always where, are people building their own snowflakes because that is so much easier? Or are they looking at what is out there and try to reuse things responsibly, hopefully really understanding what those things that actually exist mean, right? And that's the tricky part where it always takes policies around what does reuse mean? Is there some review process? Do we try to encourage reuse? And that's the tricky part about anything that has this registry value pattern in it, but at least it's a way of how you can manage that space of new activities existing over time, and also the ability of people to say, hey, I'm publishing an activity that is something completely new, something that never existed before, and therefore I'm inventing a new verb. And those who don't know it will have no idea what it means. Right? And activity streams there have a model where you can also make some tweaks to existing ones and so forth. And there was a long discussion, should we be able to do subtyping of activities? But that would have become relatively complicated on a technical level, so that was not done in the end. But regardless of the specific details on the technical level, I think just that pattern in itself is very interesting. And the challenge that you have whenever you do things like this will be to educate those people who write new software, who write new services, who evolve things, to learn about the things that are out there, right? To educate them and to tell them, these are the existing things. If you want to publish something, if you want to have an API that uses those concepts, first look at the things that exist before you come up with something new. And even though that might sound challenging, right, we have a lot of examples where it works. One of my favorite two examples where it seems to work very well are existing registries that everybody always uses, even though maybe implicitly, which are used in a lot of protocols, actually, in a lot of APIs. And those are the registries for languages and for countries. Right? We accept the fact that somewhere somebody decides for us which countries exist and which languages exist and how we identify them. Right? We don't want to go through the hassle of figuring out which are the, I don't even know how many are there, 200 countries on Earth or something like this. Right? We don't want to do that. So in that case, it really works that if I, as a developer, have the problem of I want to have an API where people put a country code in, it's unlikely that I will actually define that concept, right? I would rather say, use a standard country code, here's a standard for it, right? So it does work. And it does take some education of the people who built those APIs, but I think it's a good pattern, and it's a proven pattern, and it's something where you can make sure that you get more reuse of concepts instead of getting more snowflakes, which usually you really don't want to have. And what we went through, and I'll keep that very short because I'm running out of time, but it was just a sort of an interesting exercise. So we wanted to harmonize those things, right, those variables, and we looked at what are all the things that these things actually produce. So what are the activity types, for example, that such a watch allows me to say, I'm currently running, I'm hiking, I'm biking, all these things, right? And even there, it kind of gets messy. So I went through this exercise of looking at all the different exercise types that different manufacturers create, right? Adidas and Apple, Nike, Google, all the services that create some kind of activity, physical activity, right? And of course they don't match, right? One company, for example, says you can only run. Another company says, well, you can trail run and you can road run, right? And then you get into this problem of how do you harmonize those things? And if instead, which in that case didn't happen, right? But if instead there was some way of going back to a shared vocabulary of those things, you wouldn't end up with that complicated picture. So that is sort of the motivation of all of that, trying to do more harmonizing things that allow you to manage that value space separately in a registry. So to conclude, really what I want to encourage you to do is just whenever you run into those design issues, design situations where you have the choice of putting certain values into an API or taking them out and manage them separately, I think you should at least think about managing them separately, right? And putting them into something where those evolving value sets can be managed in a way that allows this value space to evolve without affecting the protocol itself. And like I said, I think there's very good proof for the fact that this works. IETF has a large set of those registries, around 2,000. W3C is still a little bit learning about all of that, so because that is kind of my hobby, I'm keeping tabs of where W3C probably should have registries and doesn't. And their automobile API, by the way, is one of the places where they should have a registry and they don't have one. But they're looking into it. So I think they have seen the light and they might actually do it eventually. And I think that's also something where as API creators and APIs designers and API managers, we might want to do the same thing and then think about, can we separate our APIs from some of the values that we think will evolve over time and then have more stable APIs and manage that registry as something that is separated from the other part. And here are the examples I already talked about. So, well, with that, I basically want to leave you alone and just conclude by saying that for scalable protocol design and scalable also over time, and actually in that case, mostly over time, I think, right? I think that we still sometimes lack a little bit of patterns and best practices and things we should consider when building protocols, designing protocols. And I think that this pattern of registries and trying to separate those things will be something that we will see more and more, and I hope that we will also get more and more support from the technical side so that we can easier manage registries, pull them into software, figure out which values exist, and then we actually can have, for complex and evolving spaces such as IoT, right, we have a better chance of keeping our protocols, our APIs stable, but still allowing other things within that space to evolve over time so that clients who use those protocols still can use those protocols, but they can also learn about new values that have been defined over time. Okay, and with that I'm done. Thank you very much. And I think we have a Q&A now, right? Yeah.